Hello, this is one of about 200 talks that I'm giving on the history of Western art. And this section, section 12, is on Tudor and Stuart art. And I'm talking about portraits of Elizabeth I, and specifically, were they regarded as propaganda? Now, when Elizabeth came to the throne in 1558, she was besieged by problems. There had been terrible harvests in the previous 2 years, rampant inflation, partly caused by Henry VIII's reducing the silver content of coins. And in the previous 11 years, the country had veered from extreme Protestantism to extreme Catholicism. And the same year she became Queen, 1558, the country lost Calais, its last remnant of French territory. And in addition to all this, Elizabeth was, of course, a woman, and it was assumed she would soon marry, with the danger of the country being run by a foreigner for their own interests. Yet, by the end of her reign, England was a world power. Pope Sixtus V, for example, couldn't understand it. He said, "She is only a woman, only mistress of half an island, and yet she makes herself feared by Spain, by France, by all." So how does she do it? She was intelligent, shrewd, chose her advisors well, and became popular by creating and reinforcing powerful images of herself. And this talk explores those images, and we start by comparing these two. Now, the historian Roy Strong illustrates the wonder of the transformation of images of Elizabeth by contrasting these particular two pictures. The first on the left was painted when she was young and virtuous, 14 years old, and the other over 40 years later, where she's seen towering over the realm of England, an image of almost cosmic power. The first, a demure girl, wearing the latest French fashion, but unostentatiously, and holding a prayer book. The second is full of symbols and hidden messages, which we will unravel later. So, were her portraits fashion or propaganda? To some extent, of course, they were both, but her later portraits increasingly use symbolism to project a complex message of female power. But in order to explain how this occurred, I have to first set the scene by talking about the Tudor dynasty, show you some other portraits of the period. But let me first look at an image of Elizabeth to make an important point about the Elizabethan age. This is the Siena sieve portrait. The Tudors loved puzzles, so their poetry, their pageants and pictures are full of hidden symbolism and references to classical mythology. I'll be pointing this out as we go along, but to set the scene, they mostly believed, or at least enjoyed reading, the story of British history described by Geoffrey of Monmouth, a 12th century historian who wrote History of the Kings of Britain. And he traced British kings back to Brutus, who named and founded Britain. Now, this myth of Brutus was that Brutus descended from Aeneas, the Trojan who fled Troy, had an affair with Dido, the queen and founder of Carthage, and then founded Rome. And it was alleged that Brutus was a great-grandson, or possibly great-great-grandson of Aeneas. And Brutus was exiled from Italy after accidentally killing his father, fled to Britain, which he named after himself, and became allegedly the first king of all Britain. Now, as the Tudors were of Welsh descent and were an ancient family, they were believed by many to be directly descended from Brutus and the Trojans. A nice story. If you look at this picture, the pillar behind Elizabeth on the left shows the story of Dido and Aeneas, the ancestor of Brutus. And it suggests, therefore, that Elizabeth, like Aeneas, rejected marriage in order to found an empire. But why, you might wonder, is she carrying a sieve? And who are those people behind her? We will be discussing those elements later. First, let us begin with the earliest portrait we have of Elizabeth. She was about 12 years old and is shown here on the right. Mary was about 29 on the left. Edward to the immediate left of King Henry VIII was about 8. And so this shows the whole Tudor family, excluding Henry VII. We have, starting from the left, Lady Mary, Prince Edward, Henry VIII, Jane Seymour, and Lady Elizabeth. It was painted around 1545. The clever amongst you might be thinking, but Jane Seymour died in 1537 after giving birth to Edward. So how can they be shown together? The answer is that it's a painting that doesn't pretend to show a scene that actually took place, but it's telling a story. And we assume that his third wife, Jane Seymour, is shown here because she had provided him with his long-desired male heir, Edward. And his wife, at this time this was painted, was Catherine Parr, and she isn't shown in the painting. So this painting is designed to show the Tudor ancestry, the Tudor family, its magnificence, and its important succession to critical elements of a successful monarch: magnificence and succession. I haven't mentioned, and you might be wondering, who are those strange people outside shown through the doorways? The one on the left is Jane Fool, jester to Catherine Parr, Mary I, and possibly also Anne Boleyn. And on the right, with a monkey picking fleas from his hair, is Will Sommers, Henry's personal fool. We don't know who painted this, or who commissioned it, or why it was painted. Its style is heavily influenced by Hans Holbein the Younger. Paintings were expensive and they were produced for a reason, typically to celebrate an occasion or an event or make a statement. And portraits of the monarch were much in demand because they were you could use them to declare your loyalty to the monarch. And in this case, it reinforces Henry's position as a leading European monarch. And outside the doorways, we see, as well as the Fool's, Whitehall Palace, one of the largest palaces in Europe. So why are the Fools shown in this picture? We don't know. It might be that they're simply part of the furniture. They are the sort of attributes of magnificence of a wealthy king, along with the gilded walls, the enormous palace, the sumptuous clothing, large family, and 2 Fools. But we have another picture of Elizabeth painted a couple of years later, 1546-47, possibly by William Scrots. We're not sure about that. She's wearing the latest French fashion, as I said. She wasn't proud of her features. She sent this portrait to her brother, noting, "The face, I grant, I may well blush to offer, but the mind I shall never be ashamed to present." She had a pale complexion, auburn hair like her father, a delicate mouth, and a firmly set jaw. Her eyes are black like her mother's, Anne Boleyn, and she was said at the time to look like her grandfather, Henry VII. You can see in this painting here. She may have had high cheekbones because she's shown that way in some later portraits. She's displaying her long fingers, which she was proud of all through her life. She's been interrupted while reading. She still has a finger in the book, and another page is marked with a slip of paper. It's probably a prayer book, which suggests that she was a good Christian who didn't waste her time on idle matters. Of course, at this time, there wasn't any thought that Elizabeth would ever become queen. She was third in line after Edward and Mary. She was simply marriage fodder to form some useful political alliance with another country in Europe. The other thing to mention at this point is what's called the Thomas Seymour affair, if affair is the right word. When Henry VIII died in 1547, his son Edward became Edward VI. And at that time, Henry's wife, now ex-wife, Catherine Parr, married Thomas Seymour, shown here, a brother of Jane Seymour and Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector. Now, Thomas and Catherine took Elizabeth into their house at Chelsea, and we don't know what happened in detail, but we do know he abused his position by engaging in what you could think of as horseplay, but he entered her bedroom in his nightgown, tickled her, even slapped her buttocks, and on one occasion cut her dress into 1,000 pieces. Finally, when Catherine Parr found them in an embrace, the relationship was ended and Elizabeth was sent away. 4 months after that, Catherine Parr died and Seymour renewed his attention towards Elizabeth, and this was the last straw. Seymour was arrested for plotting to marry Elizabeth and was beheaded 6 months later. Now, was Elizabeth party to this? She admitted nothing, despite intense cross-examination by a very experienced interrogator, Sir Robert Tyrwhitt. Now, Tyrwhitt had been Catherine Parr's master of the horse, and so he knew a lot about the circumstances of the household, and he had a very keen mind. But despite threats, flattery, forged letters, and false confessions, Elizabeth and her 2 servants said nothing. Elizabeth employed sulking, crying, and attacking her accusers, including Tyrwhitt. He said in the end, "She hath a very good wit, and nothing is to be gotten of her except by great policy." In other words, she could look after herself. She was very bright. She could speak complete sentences by 18 months. And by the age of 11, she spoke 6 languages fluently. And as we have seen, at the age of 15, she was able to defend herself. So not only intelligent, but politically astute. This painting of Elizabeth is now at Windsor Castle, and William Scrott's, believed to be the painter, is the artist who took over from Hans Holbein as the King's painter. Everyone's of course heard of Holbein, but few have heard of Scrott's, although he was paid twice the salary Holbein received. Holbein received £30 a year, and Scrott's was paid £62 10 shillings a year. He was from the Netherlands and continued as the King's painter during Edward's reign, but disappeared from the records after that. This is Edward. believed again to be by William Scrots. And I'm going to show you a few portraits leading up to the portrait of Elizabeth. Edward became king when Henry VIII died, when he was aged only 9. Of course, everyone expected Edward would rule for the rest of his long life, but he died only 6 years later at the age of 15. There were rumours at the time of poisoning, but these were normal rumours when a king died, and a surgeon who performed the autopsy reported he had died of lung disease, and most historians now think he died of tuberculosis, what used to be called consumption. And we know he had a bout of measles and smallpox the year before, and that probably suppressed his immune system. Now, Edward barred both his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, from succeeding him, and named his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his successor. So we have the sad episode of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen. She was one of the most learned women of the period and was only 16 or 17 when she became queen, and wasn't as politically astute as Elizabeth. Mary objected. Mary gathered an army and marched on London, and Jane was deposed. She was initially imprisoned, but when Thomas Wyatt led a rebellion to stop Mary marrying Philip II of Spain, Jane and her husband were executed. We don't know whether this is a genuine portrait of Lady Jane Grey, because we know it was painted some 40 years after her death. It's known as the Streatham portrait. It came to light in 2005, so fairly recently. And it may be a copy of an earlier portrait, but the quality is so poor, it's even been described as folk art. Portraits of royalty were much in demand, and most people had never seen the person represented. And the distinction between what you might call artists and painters wasn't as well developed in England as in Italy. And so a painter would be a member of the Painters and Stainers Guild, would have painted inn signs, furniture and banners and so on. But let me show you next a well-known and successful Netherlandish painter called Antonio More, and his portrait of Mary I, the year after she became queen, which was in 1553. Now, More was a leading painter in Europe. I could describe him as the leading painter after Titian. He painted royalty and nobility all across Europe. This painting was commissioned by Emperor Charles V, who had arranged the marriage of his son Philip of Spain to Mary for dynastic reasons. It was painted after the marriage, and it wasn't exchanged with Philip before the marriage. Let me just show you a painting by Titian of Philip II, the man she married. This is the pinnacle of Italian Renaissance painting at the time, a painting by Titian. Mary was described at the time as not at all beautiful, rather small, and more skinny than stout. She is very white and red. She has no eyebrows. And so it went on. She became known, of course, as Bloody Mary because she insisted on burning Protestants, 283 in total, despite the advice of even her Spanish advisors. She lived for only 5 years, and in 1558 she died, possibly from ovarian cysts or uterine cancer. Philip, her husband, was in Brussels at the time and wrote to his sister, "I felt a reasonable regret for her death." So clearly they didn't have a close relationship. Which brings this to what looks like a very early portrait of Elizabeth because she's in her coronation robes, but we know it was painted towards the end of her reign, 1600 to 1610. It's possibly, though, it's believed it's a copy of a lost original from 1559, the year of her coronation. Now, she became queen. The central problem she had was she was a woman. It was expected she would soon marry, as Mary had done. It was hoped, believed, she would marry a Protestant. And this is an early portrait of, or if it's a copy of an early portrait of Elizabeth, I'll be showing you 3 phases that her portraits went through. Early on, from the time she became queen to about 5 years later, so for the first 5 years, the portraits were of relatively poor quality. They were in massive demand across Europe. People wanted to know what she looked like, but they weren't very accurate. Then we have a period of about 10 years, 1563 to 1573, when there were fashionable portraits of Elizabeth because they were produced when she was looking for a suitable husband. So they were sent around Europe with the express purpose of showing what she was like to potential suitors. And then from that point onwards, the third phase, they were what we could call propaganda portraits, associating Elizabeth with positive symbols that did not involve marriage. The Virgin Queen, Empress of the Seas, head of state and the church. And I think this portrait gives a clue to some of these later symbols. Although as it's a copy made at the end of her reign, it may not exactly copy the lost original. I think the important thing here to associate with her coronation was the speech she made to her council at the time of her coronation, when she reinstated the medieval notion of the 2 bodies of the monarch. She said, "I am but one body naturally considered, though by his permission a body politic to govern." This, I believe, was an early way for her to deal with being a woman. She knew the whole council and the country were worried about having a woman as monarch. And it was thought, of course, the Queen would marry, and the choice of king was a risk to the country. The country had come very close to becoming a province of the Spanish Empire during Mary's reign. But what Elizabeth was saying was that although her physical body was that of a woman, her body politic was not physical. It was ageless, timeless. It was of a monarch ordained by God. To reinforce this message, notice her portrait is not like a Holbein or an Antonio More, but harks back to this medieval portrait of Richard II that was and still is in Westminster Abbey. It was a portrait produced at the time. Unusually, very few portraits were painted at this time. It's as if she is conforming with the medieval traditions to show the ageless and timeless image of a monarch. She'd already divided herself, in other words, between her physical body, which might be a woman, and her body politic, which was a monarch and sexless. This is the period of some poor quality versions. We don't know who painted them. She didn't produce or employ high quality painters to produce an official portrait. She wasn't particularly interested in her portrait being painted. But there was a lot of demand from all over Europe, and painters and artists of all levels and standards produced portraits. It was important, of course, that her official image projected the right qualities, but she didn't seem to be concerned about that, probably because she had more important things to deal with. It was so bad that Catherine de' Medici, the Queen of France, wife of Henry II, received reports from her ambassadors that Elizabeth was beautiful, and based on the evidence of her portraits that Catherine de' Medici had seen, she wrote, "I must declare she did not have good painters," and she even offered to send one of her own painters to Elizabeth. And when someone under the European Court complained about Elizabeth's portrait, the Earl of Sussex said, "I answered at first that the portrait bore no resemblance to your Majesty." In other words, her diplomats were sort of declining to authenticate the portraits. They were saying they looked nothing like her. I said she had other things to deal with. I mean, the portraits were less important than her concern about invasion by the French and the Scots. But we do know that her councillors considered issuing a proclamation. This is the proclamation, or this is the draft. It was never actually issued. It was a draft written by Sir William Cecil, one of her advisors, and it says her subjects are forbidden from painting, graving, printing, or making of any portrait of Her Majesty until some special person that shall be by her allowed shall have first finished a portraiture thereof, after which finished, Her Majesty will be content that all other painters or gravers shall and may at their pleasure follow the said patron or first portraiture. In other words, what would happen is Elizabeth would appoint a good painter to paint one portrait, she would then approve it, and then every other artist in the country had to copy that one portrait. But there was no system of approval set up, and we know portraits were copied in lots of different media. There was no approval system. Maybe this was drafted because there were scurrilous images of Elizabeth being produced on the continent, and possibly her council was concerned about these and trying to prevent them in England, but it was never implemented. This is the first high quality likeness by Stephen van der Meulen in 1563. It was said that Elizabeth, quote, hath been always of her own disposition, unwilling for anyone to take the natural representation of Her Majesty. But this painting suggests she was persuaded eventually to change her mind. It's unique as it symbolically refers to her becoming a wife and a mother. That's the fruit and flowers you can see on the right, referring to her fecundity. And this was one of the portraits that would be sent around Europe to show what she looked like, because I think the pressure to marry was increasing, because she died, or nearly died, of smallpox the previous year. She caught smallpox in 1562 at Hampton Court, and because she'd almost died, it led to a much more urgent search for a suitable marriage partner, and to as part of that process, these portraits were produced of giving a better likeness of what she actually looked like, And this is the beginning of her political propaganda messages. This particular one is propaganda showing she's a suitable candidate for marriage. She is fecund, fruitful, and showing her magnificence in the use of all of the gold behind her. It's also an early vision of Elizabeth of us as Astrea, the virgin goddess of justice, innocence, and purity, who ruled the earth during the Golden Age when fruit and other crops were so plentiful no one needed to farm because you could just pick the food you needed. Also notice in this portrait her white face and lack of shadow. It's possible she started to use heavy makeup to hide smallpox scars, and it's possible she wore a wig, as there's some evidence she lost her hair at the time she suffered from smallpox. We do know she had many wigs. This heavy white makeup was also fashionable, and possibly because only workers in the field had sunburnt faces, and so a white face showed that you didn't have to work outside. The magnificence is demonstrated the amount of gold, which much more excessive than is normally found in paintings of the period, and the low view point looking up at it suggests it would be hung fairly high up, creating an imposing and magnificent portrait to stun any viewers. The symbols you can see in it, she's wearing a red and white dress, the colours of the houses of Lancashire and York, combined in the Tudor rose. She's wearing a red rose on her shoulder, the Tudor rose, and a reference also to the Virgin Mary. She's holding a gillyflower or carnation, another symbol of the Virgin Mary, and also a symbol of love and marriage. And at the end of the string of pearls, it's a bit hard to see in this reproduction, there's an armillary sphere, which she uses in later portraits, referring, we think, to the celestial harmony her reign will bring the kingdom. And as I said, the gold background demonstrates magnificence, and the floral tapestry on the right suggests fecundity and her suitability to be married and have many children, be fruitful. So from this point on, her portraits become more and more symbolic. But I'll start by looking at one or two allegorical paintings because they tell us something about the qualities Elizabeth was trying to convey before or beyond all the symbols and myths combined together into propaganda messages in her later great portraits. By the way, although at this time, 1563, she is clearly expressing her intention to marry, by the end of the 1560s and it was clear she had no intention of marrying. This portrait became an embarrassment later on. So one of the allegorical paintings, Elizabeth and the Three Goddesses of 1569. Before I talk about the symbolism of this painting and therefore its propaganda value, I need to define what I mean by propaganda, and I think it helps if I clarify what I mean in terms of the way that it was understood at the time. Now today, propaganda means information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. But it didn't mean that then. Let me give you an example. In 1622, Pope Gregory XV created a committee of cardinals responsible for spreading the faith in foreign countries, and he called it the Congregation of Propaganda Fidei, or the Propagation of the Faith. So prior to the 20th century, propaganda simply meant propagating a set of beliefs. So what were those beliefs that Elizabeth wanted to propagate? I've already said she wanted to promote the distinction between her physical body and her political body. And this is one of two allegorical paintings I'll be showing you. It's painted in a mixture of Italian Mannerist and English styles. Note, Elizabeth is painted in the flat style, the English style, and the goddesses are in the Mannerist, Italian Mannerist style. They're rounded, they're shaded, they're three-dimensional figures. It's as if the artist came to England from abroad, adopted the English style for the English figures, and then painted in the conventional Italian Mannerist style for the rest of the painting. It's thought it was painted by Hans Eweth, as the initials HE are on the painting. It shows us her political body, which is a symbol, what she means to the nation. It's not obvious what's going on here to the modern mind. It looks as though she just popped outside, found three women, one of them naked and holding a small boy with wings. You could probably guess, though, that they're three goddesses. And the answer is made clearer by some lines of poetry that were written underneath the painting. They were in Latin, but in translation they said, Pallas was keen of brain, Juno was queen of might, the rosy face of Venus was in beauty shining bright. Elizabeth then came, and overwhelmed Queen Juno took to flight. Pallas was silenced, Venus blushed for shame. So I think that poem makes it clear what the meaning is. Elizabeth appears before the three most powerful goddesses that were so far surpassed in brain, beauty, and might that they ran away, fall silent, or blush. And it's a reminder of the mythological story of the judgment of Paris, when Paris, son of Priam, the king of Troy, was selected by Zeus because he was seen to be a fair judge to choose which of these three goddesses to award a golden apple to. But it's been turned on its head. In this case, the apple is represented by the orb of state, not the golden apple, which Elizabeth is holding, because she excels the goddesses. So it's a triumphant virgin queen, monarch of an empire, and woman whose virtues will encourage a suitor to marry her. So we're still at the stage where some of the symbolism here is encouraging marriage. One more of these allegorical paintings. This is the family of Henry VIII, the allegory of the Tudor succession, now in the National Museum of Wales, 1572. And in this, we see Mary, the Catholic Mary, and her husband Philip II of Spain on the left, with Mars, the god of war. And on the right, we have the Protestant Elizabeth ushering in behind her the goddesses of peace and plenty, and peace is stamping on the sword of war and breaking it in two. It also is a reminder that Elizabeth was the daughter of Henry VIII, who we see passing the sword of justice to his son Edward. And this is pure propaganda. It combines political and religious messages, and it shows those messages united within the political body of Elizabeth. It was painted as a gift to Sir Francis Walsingham for his help negotiating the Treaty of Blois, which was a peace treaty with Catherine de' Medici that isolated Spain. It was painted in 1572, and later that year was the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre that took place in France, when French Protestants were massacred by French Catholics. Many thousands died, and many fled to England, bringing with it fears of a Catholic invasion. And so from the early 1570s, Elizabeth's portraits became increasingly abstract and increasingly laden with symbols and promoting specific myths. Let me show you the first, the Pelican portrait, now in the Walker Art Gallery, 1574, the Virgin Queen. It was clear by this stage, when she was then 41, that there was no intention for her to marry. And pictures of her change to present an image that combines mythology, religion, and politics. There's elaborate symbolism, rich detail. Her figure is stylized, flat, her face mask-like. She's shown against a flat background. There's little attempt at spatial depth. This portrait was discovered in 2010 and was found with the Phoenix portrait, both painted on wood from the same tree, and the tracing of the face is identical, although reversed in the Phoenix portrait. Let me go through some of the symbols quickly, just pick them out from this picture. First of all, in the center there is a pelican. It's a symbol of Christ's sacrifice because it was believed the pelican fed her young by pecking her breast and releasing her own blood to feed her young. So it was a sign of Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. In the context of Elizabeth, it represents Elizabeth as the mother of the Church of England and mother to her people who would sacrifice her own life for them. Then we see up here the Tudor rose, emblem of the Tudor family with the royal crown above to show her regal status. It's combining the red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York, showing the Tudors united the two sides and ended the War of the Roses. And the rose is a dominant motif in the portrait, shown in the pattern on her blouse. The fleur-de-lis on the other side is the emblem of France, and this is a statement of her claim to the throne of France. She signs herself Queen of England and France, even though Calais, the last piece of French territory, had been lost at just before the beginning of her reign, at the last year of the reign of her sister Mary. Look at her ear, just about make out there's cherries hanging over her ear. Again, a symbol, this time it means sweetness. It's a reward for virtue, and it's traditionally an attribute of the Virgin Mary. Cherries were known as the fruit of paradise, and they symbolized heaven. They also refer to virginity. Her, quotes, cherry remains untouched. Then there's a fan of feathers made from exotic and expensive ostrich feathers imported from Arabia. A fan like this was presented to Elizabeth every year by a group of city merchants. Then here there's the thornless rose, another symbol of the Virgin Mary, suggesting again the Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen, was married to England in the same way that the Virgin Mary was married to the Church. And then finally, this thing she's holding here, we don't know what it is. It's either a glove or a leather pouch. If it's a pouch, it might be significant in that it might point to the painting's origin. It may have been commissioned by a group of city merchants who presented the fan, as I said, and in order to commemorate the granting of some rights or privileges, it could be that they commissioned this portrait and show Elizabeth holding in the pouch the documents relating to that granting of some rights. However, the balance of evidence, I think, from other portraits is that it's probably a glove, which was a sign of elegance. This is the Phoenix portrait I mentioned, and the jewel at her breast there is a phoenix, a mythical bird symbolizing both rebirth and chastity. And it became associated with the Queen in the 1570s. It's also an emblem of virginity, uniqueness, and it's a reassurance she would be able to regenerate the dynasty. She's shown holding a red rose as well, the symbol of the House of Tudor. Now, despite her status as the Virgin Queen, in 1871, when she was at 38, there were still a few serious marriage negotiations taking place between Elizabeth and Henry, Duke of Anjou. The phoenix was a long-lived bird, believed to live hundreds or thousands of years, that was cyclically reborn or regenerated, and it's associated with the sun and obtains new life by arising from the ashes of its predecessor, who without the phoenix gives life to a new version of itself without the need for sex to procreate. So there's a whole cloud of associations building up. These symbols often have no single simple meaning. Imagine a cloud of associations. The phoenix could symbolize renewal, but also could refer to the sun or time or the empire or reincarnation or consecration, resurrection, life in paradise, Christ, the Virgin Mary, virginity, the exceptional, and aspects of Christian life. So as you can see, it wasn't a matter of straightforward decoding. It was a matter of looking at all the symbols that were present and forming a view based on the sort of a unified interpretation that arose from the joint aspects of all the various symbols. It was also another source was what were called emblem books. Let me just show you one page from Geoffrey Whitney's A Choice of Emblems. And there were a number of different emblem books at the time. They, as I said earlier, Elizabethans loved puzzles, and every noble would have a personal device or impresa, which embodied their deepest values, but coded up in a way that only someone who was versed in classics or mythology could decipher it. And this was helped by looking in emblem books, which contain hundreds of emblems and mottos and moral lessons. Each page typically had a title, an image, and a poem. And they were very popular, and they helped you decrypt complex images and messages. This poem describes how the phoenix is said to live 1,000 years, and there was only ever one of its kind, and it renewed itself in a fire from which a new phoenix was reborn. The poem goes on to talk about a town that was burnt down and then rebuilt, but the symbol applies to anything that is unique and renews itself. And as I said, unlike other birds, it renews itself without needing a mate. The other point I wanted to make before looking at more portraits of Elizabeth is a particular aspect of those paintings. It's essentially the white face. This is a typical Tudor garden with formal beds. Each bed has a pole with an emblem on top, and gardens provide an alternative explanation of why Elizabeth is often painted with a flat white face. Now, Elizabeth was talking to an artist, Nicholas Hilliard, and they started talking about painting, and we're lucky in that he recorded the conversation and published it in his book on painting, a treatise concerning the art of limning. And in it, he wrote, after showing me how she noted great difference of shadowing in the works and the diversity of drawers of sundry nations, and that the Italians, who had the name to be the cunningest and to draw best, shadowed not, required of me the reason of it, seeing that best to show oneself needeth no shadow of place, but rather the open light, the which I granted and affirmed. So what's going on here? The conversation tells us that Elizabeth believed that the best artists were the Italians, and they, she believed, did not use shadows, which of course was a mistake because the Italians used shadows and shading to create form. But Hilliard, who was painting her, was a miniaturist, and miniatures, which are held close to the eye, typically don't use shadows for modelling but are painted flat. Hilliard therefore agreed with Elizabeth and confirmed her belief that the best artists don't use shadows. And Hilliard goes on to tell us they then went into the garden and she sat in the open light where there were no shadows to enable him to paint a miniature. So there's a number of misunderstandings in this conversation that possibly was one reason why she's shown with a flat white face, arising from her belief that the Italians didn't use shadows, her observation that miniatures painted by Hilliard, there were few shadows, and also that the best effect was found not by sitting under the shadow of a tree, but by sitting in the open light. I mean, assume under an overcast sky rather than in sunlight. Also, of course, being in the shadows is associated with concealment, which suggests treachery and evil deeds. But being outside, out of the shadows in the full light of day is something that she agreed with Hilliard to be painted in that way. This is puzzling. This is Federico Zuccaro, who was a famous Italian artist. But what we don't know is how did he get papal dispensation to come to Protestant England in 1575? It's true the popes always hoped Elizabeth would return to the true faith, but it's still incredible that Pope Gregory XIII would allow a skilled artist like Zuccaro to paint Elizabeth, who'd been excommunicated in 1570 by Pope Pius V. She's shown here in the pose of Christina of Denmark. And although it's difficult to interpret symbols as they depend on context, you can see on the right, on the top of the column, there's a dog representing fidelity. There's an ermine next to the dog representing purity. And the column represents constancy. And then can you see the snake climbing up the column? That represents prudence. Often columns like this are shown in pairs, and it's a reference to a symbol adopted by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, a reference to the Straits of Gibraltar, which were regarded as the gateway to the Mediterranean. And with the discovery of the Americas, Charles V saw them, the Straits of Gibraltar, as a sort of entrance out to the rest of the world. And it's imagined that either side of the Straits of Gibraltar were the pillars of Hercules, which you'd pass between to go out to the rest of the world. And ultimately, for example, the dollar sign in America with its two vertical lines through it, those vertical lines derive from the Spanish dollar and represented the pillars of Hercules. Now, this drawing was probably a model for the Darnley portrait shown here, attributed to Zucchero, one of the more important images of Elizabeth. This is the Darnley portrait, probably painted from life, and a pattern known as the Mask of Youth that remained for the rest of her life as the standard way of representing her. We can tell from the brushwork it was painted by an experienced artist. Notice it's looser but bolder painting than most of the British artists. The reason I'm attributing it to Zucchero is the historian Roy Strong believed that it was by Zucchero, although I should add that the curators of the National Portrait Gallery don't think that the attribution to Zucchero is sustainable. But they don't know who painted the work. They just say it's an unknown continental, possibly Dutch artist. The pose, incidentally, follows this pose of Isabella of Portugal by Titian. The look, the Mask of Youth look, is cold, haughty, imperious. She's wearing a doublet with a lace ruff collar, a double string of pearls looped around her neck, and an ostrich feather fan. The pendant jewel down there shows the Roman gods Minerva at the top, Jupiter, ruler of the gods, at the bottom, Venus, goddess of love, on the right, with Cupid, and on the left, Mars, the god of war. Note the crown and scepter behind her on the right. And there are various other symbols which I'll expand upon later in other portraits. She was now 42. It was clear she wouldn't be marrying. So various roles were being found to present her to the people. She was the virgin queen who was married to the country, but she had many, many aspects to her, and she was referred to in many different ways. I'll just give you a few examples. She was Gloriana, a name that suggests an earlier golden age of glory from Greek mythology. She was Good Queen Bess, of course, Deborah, the only female judge in the Bible and one who led a counterattack, Judith from the Bible who beheaded Holofernes, Tuche, the Roman Vestal Virgin, Diana, the goddess of hunting, Cynthia from Raleigh's unfinished and unpublished poem, Astrea, the goddess of justice, innocence and purity, and many, many others. Belphoebe, Pandora, and so on. This is the painting we saw earlier. Now, many of the paintings were commissioned by her courtiers to promote Elizabeth and to include their own personal message, a sort of form of praise and of lobbying. Now, if you look closely to the chap in the background, you can, it's a bit difficult to make out, but just about make out there's a white heart on his sleeve, which was the emblem of Sir Christopher Hatton. And Hatton was the patron of John Dee, perhaps the most learned man of the period. He was an astronomer, mathematician, magician, and advisor to Elizabeth. And from 1570, it was Dee who advocated a policy of imperial expansion into the New World, and in particular, building up a navy. Dee's ideas were years ahead of their time, and in fact, it was Dee who's credited with the coining of the term British Empire. And look at the globe. You'll see ships sailing across the Atlantic between Britain and the New World. That was Dee's vision, that we would develop a navy that could control and span the world. So it's a sort of piece of lobbying by Hatton, using a portrait of Elizabeth as part of a political campaign by an individual. When we see these portraits of Elizabeth, we always tend to assume that maybe she commissioned them, or in conjunction with her council or the government, they were commissioned to convey a state message. But often it's an individual lobbying Elizabeth. You might wonder, why is she carrying a sieve? The symbol goes back to a story from Petrarch. The Vestal Virgin Tuccia carried water from the Tiber to the Temple of Vesta in Rome in a sieve to prove her innocence and virginity. The sieve is something that separates the desirable from the undesirable, and it's also therefore a symbol of prudence, and because it entails the ability to discern. It's also a symbol of virginity. And as I said earlier, the column on the left, which is covered in medallions, shows the story of Dido and Aeneas from an engraving by Marc Antonio Raimondi. It's a story of how Dido and Aeneas fall in love, but Aeneas leaves her to go off and found Rome, and Elizabeth, like Aeneas, rejects love and marriage in order to found an empire. We have to remember that the state of virginity had very negative connotations in the 16th century. People were almost embarrassed by it, as it was a symbol of failure and associated with old maids. And so this portrait and other sieve portraits were created to create a new set of positive associations around the idea of a virgin queen. I haven't explained how portraits helped Elizabeth keep her male court in order. From the beginning, her relationship with her courtiers was of a lady and her suitor, controlled by the conventions of courtly love. And the whole point, in a way, of courtly love is it's never consummated. The lady is unreachable, but the suitor goes to the ends of the earth to do whatever the lady wishes, and to praise the lady. So, and finding exotic ways to praise the lady. Any command issued by the lady was a requirement on the knight to obey. The knight was honor bound to obey under the conventions of courtly love. So there's this complex relationship with all of the courtiers who entertained Elizabeth, giving presents, including paintings, and occasionally Elizabeth would give a gift in return. And here's an example. On the 26th of September 1580, the Golden Hind sailed into Plymouth with Drake and 59 remaining crew members aboard. with an extremely rich cargo of spices and captured Spanish treasures. In fact, the Queen's half share of the cargo was greater than the rest of the Crown's income for that entire year. This is the Drake jewel. Elizabeth gave it to Sir Francis Drake either in 1586, the date on the miniature, or 1588 to commemorate the defeat of the Spanish Armada. Inside the cover, there's a miniature and a picture of a phoenix, as I've said, a symbol commonly associated with Elizabeth, representing chastity, rebirth, and continuity. And it was very fashionable at the time to wear lockets like this, containing a miniature of your loved one. And many people wore lockets containing Elizabeth's portrait. This one was produced by Elizabeth to give to Drake an enormous honour. In fact, he was the first time a commoner had been granted such a privilege. You might be interested in the cameo. It's carved out of 2 layers of a coloured stone, which has been carefully crafted so that the 2 layers, the 2 colours in the stone show through to show 2 heads in contrasting colours. It's been suggested that the black head, the black male head, may represent Saturn, and the white female head, Astrea, the virgin goddess. So it proclaims Elizabeth's reign as a return to the legendary Golden Age, when Saturn ruled over a period of peace and prosperity, and Astrea distributed blessings. This is the ermine portrait. It shows Elizabeth as the Virgin, Queen and Goddess, Elizabeth as Pax or Peace, bearing the olive branch of peace, the sword of justice resting on the table. She was now 52, still painted based on the mask of youth. The ermine, incidentally, is regarded as a symbol of royalty and majesty and purity. And she's wearing one of her most treasured jewels, known as the Three Brothers jewel. It's 3 rectangular red spindles, rubies, in a triangular arrangement, separated by 3 round white pearls with a deep blue diamond in the centre, shaped like a pyramid. This is the peace portrait. She's holding an olive branch in her left hand. There's a sheathed sword at her feet. The headdress she's wearing, possibly from the ermine portrait. The gown she's wearing is what's known at the time as Polish style, with froggings. That's these ornamental braidings that fasten across the garment. And this painting has long been associated with Elizabeth's favourite, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Next to the sword is a lapdog. We saw one earlier in the drawing by Federico Zuccaro, although I don't believe there's any other Elizabeth portraits that have a dog in them, but they refer to fidelity, loyalty. This may refer to an incident when Elizabeth found Dudley was planning to travel to France. She wasn't happy that he hadn't asked her first. She said, "I cannot live without seeing you every day. You are like my little dog. As soon as you are seen anywhere, people know that I am coming, and when you are seen, they say that I am not far off." This is the Armada portrait, painted in 1588, showing her as Empress of the Seas and the beginnings of the British Empire. There are actually 3 versions of this portrait. This is the version from Woburn Abbey, the seat of the Dukes of Bedford, previously believed to be by George Gower, the artist, who'd been appointed sergeant painter in 1581. There's also a version in the National Portrait Gallery and a 3rd version owned by the Tyrwhitt Drake family. In this version, the Queen's hand rests on a globe below the crown of England, her fingers covering the Americas, indicating England's dominion of the seas and plans for imperialist expansion. In the background on the left, English fire ships threaten the Spanish fleet. On the right, the ships are driven onto rocky coast amid stormy seas by the, quotes, Protestant wind. And as we saw earlier, John Dee was advocating a policy of imperial expansion into the New World and the building up of a strong navy. And the defeat of the Armada was seen to be part of a grand strategy to rule the waves. This is the Ditchley portrait, commissioned by Sir Henry Lee of Ditchley. And in fact, this portrait, he asked Elizabeth to decipher its meaning as part of his courtly entertainment. That was a common, the Tudors, as I've said, loved to decipher codes and symbols, and Elizabeth was an expert. But there's a lot going on behind this. 2 years before, in 1590, Henry Lee's wife had died, and he, at that point, decided to retire as Queen's champion and move to the country. This might also be because he'd recently met this woman, Anne Vavasor. Now, Anne Vavasor was known to the Queen. She was in fact a maid of honour to the Queen, and had previously been thrown into the Tower of London with her lover Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, as they had not obtained royal approval before becoming lovers. And the Queen found out that Henry Lee was having an affair with Anne Vavasor. At the Accession Day tilt, the annual celebration of Elizabeth becoming Queen, Lee wrote a long valedictory poem that he read out to the Queen for her to interpret, but unknown to the Queen and the court, the poem had a double meaning, and he intended it to be aimed at Anne Vavasor. Now the Queen found all this out, and luckily for Henry Lee, although she was very annoyed, she liked Henry Lee, and after 2 years of pleading, she agreed to visit his home at Ditchley to be entertained. And he laid on extremely lavish and extravagant entertainment: poetry, fairy tales, music, allegorical paintings, public speeches, courtly debate. It was a complex affair, and at one point the Queen was led into a room where Henry Lee lay in what was described as an enchanted sleep, and he could only be woken from this sleep by the Queen, who had to examine this portrait and find the solution by deciphering it. And there are fragments of Latin to help her. On the left, translated, it reads, "She gives and does not expect." On the right, it reads, "She can but does not take revenge." On the bottom right, "In giving back, she increases." And then the sonnet on the right, perhaps composed by Lee, is about the sun, the symbol of Elizabeth, or one of the symbols of Elizabeth, symbol of the monarch. and he shows Elizabeth standing on a globe, bestriding the world, with her feet in Oxfordshire, where Lee's house at Ditchley was located, with behind her a storm raging, but in front of her the sun appearing. I think the interpretation of this was obvious to everyone, and the Queen was so pleased she forgave him and allowed him to continue to live with Anne Vavasor, which they did live together. Vavasor outlived Elizabeth. In fact, she lived till she was 90, and in 1616, at the age of 56, she married John Richardson while her first husband, John Finch, was still alive, and as a consequence, she was brought up before the High Commission on a charge of bigamy, and she had to pay a fine of £2,000. However, she was spared having to make a public penance. So that's another, this portrait, the Ditchley portrait, is another example of how her courtiers used portraits to flatter the Queen. We're coming now to the last 10 years of her life. We move to the final period. There are examples during this period of unflattering portraits, some which were destroyed. Most of the portraits were based on a version created by Hilliard known as the Mask of Youth. But we believe that this portrait by Isaac Oliver was painted from life. It's the extraordinary directness of observation. Its shape incorporates it was painted on the straight edges of on a back of a playing card. It was trimmed subsequently to fit into a miniature case, or it would have been trimmed, but we can see that it wasn't trimmed fully, suggesting it was kept as a reference face pattern. It was a gentle, refined image, catching her intelligence, I think. Her face, described at the time as oblong, fair but wrinkled, her eyes small, yet black and pleasant, her nose a little hooked, her lips narrow, her hair an auburn colour, but false, is an earlier description. This might surprise you. The wrinkles, I mean. Foregoing the smooth mask of youth. This is from 1595. Some historians have speculated that this may have been subversive. However, it's from the studio of one of the leading painters of the period in England, Marcus Gerarts. And the latest theory is that her loyal subjects didn't mind the wrinkles, and many of them proudly hung pictures like this in their galleries. We don't know whether Elizabeth found it acceptable, though she was always sensitive about her portraits. Raleigh wrote she burned those she didn't like, and the following year she commanded the Privy Council to, quote, aid the Queen's sergeant painter in seeking out unseemly portraits which were to her great offence, and therefore to be defaced, and no more portraits to be produced, except as approved by the sergeant painter. So we don't know whether it's portraits like this one that she disapproved of and wanted defaced, or whether her loyal subjects sought out portraits like this, showing her as she was. Which brings me to the final portrait, at a fitting end, also or attributed to Marcus Gerarts, the rainbow portrait at Hatfield House. It has also been attributed to Isaac Oliver and Federico Zuccaro and even Nicholas Hilliard, but I'll stick with Marcus Gerarts. What does it mean? it's an interesting one to decode. What's she holding? The answer is in the Latin you see above, which translated says, "No rainbow without the sun. She is the sun and has created a rainbow, and a rainbow is the biblical sign of hope and rebirth. She's put discord and war behind her and brings forth the rainbow, signifying sunshine and peace and a new golden age beginning." So it's called the Rainbow Portrait for obvious reasons. It was painted around 1600 to 1602. She was in her late 60s and she was to die in 1603. If you look closely at her dress, you will see it's covered in eyes and ears. What do you think it means? Well, partly it means fame. Fame was signified by a covering of eyes and ears, signifying everyone looking and talking about her. But it's also been suggested they represent her, the protection of her by her loyal subjects who are always looking out for her, eyes and ears everywhere, picking up intrigues or plots against her. She also has a serpent embroidered on her sleeve with a heart hanging from its mouth. The serpent represents wisdom, and the heart, passion, showing she has the wisdom to control her passions. The celestial globe above the serpent's head means to understand higher matters, one must first go down to the earth like the serpent and then rise heavenward under good counsel. The queen is therefore skilled in the affairs of the universe. The flowers on her dress show she is Flora, another title she received, Empress of Flowers. In her hair is the crescent moon, alluding to another title, Cynthia, Queen of Seas and Lands. And on her ruff is the gauntlet, a chivalrous emblem showing she is the heroine of her knights. So she's being shown here as the queen of beauty, love, a just virgin of the golden age returned. She was very proud of the fact that there was peace throughout her reign, although I must admit this is an exaggeration, as it ignores the troops she sent against Philip II, the raid on Cadiz and the 9 Years' War in Ireland. But it's true that there were many years of peace during her reign. So this tells us a lot about Elizabeth. If we look beyond the gorgeous dress, of which she had 2,000, we find a complex web of symbolism that support clear propaganda message. The Virgin Queen, reminding us of the Virgin Mary, the Queen of the Golden Age of peace and prosperity, and the Empress of the Seas. It's a fitting end, I think, to the way Elizabeth used her portraits to convey these complex messages and maintain her position as monarch and woman. Thank you. That brings me to the end of my talk. Sorry that this talk was longer, but I had a lot to fit in, and I believe I find these portraits of Elizabeth with their symbolism and their complex codes so interesting to decode. If you'd like more information, then look at my notes where there is more information and additional images. But for now, thank you for your time and attention, and goodbye for now.